Welcome to Part 3 of The Wine Merchant. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 7. The two friends, eager and excited about their adventure, rose early the next morning. After breakfast, Gibbons went out to buy the best map of the city and its surroundings he could find. "Wow, Selden's not even in the town," he exclaimed after studying the map for a few moments. "It's up the river, looks like it's 7 or 8 miles away. The northeastern line runs through there, and there's a station. We should head out and check it out." Bostick agreed, and they grabbed a timetable, discovering there was a train at 10:35. They headed down to Paragon Station and boarded the train. Once they cleared the suburbs, the line ran close to the river, and the two friends kept a keen eye out for the station. About 4.5 miles out, they stopped at a station named Hassel, and a couple of miles further, their persistence paid off as they spotted a small pier and shed, the latter proudly displaying the name of the syndicate in large letters on its roof. Another 1.5 miles brought them to Selden, where they got off the train. "What do you say we walk back to Hassel and see what we can discover?" Gibbons suggested. They followed the road from the station inland until they reached the main street, where they turned east toward Hull. In just a few minutes, they caught sight of the depot 1/2 mile away across the fields. A lane led toward it, and they followed this path until it met the railway. There, the lane turned towards Hull and ran parallel to the tracks for a short distance, eventually doubling back to connect with the main road halfway to Hassel. The railway tracks sat on a low bank, and the men could just see over them to the syndicate's headquarters. The view wasn't great, but as far as they could tell, the depot looked a lot like the one in the land's clearing. A timber wharf extended into the water, seeming to match the size and construction of the one on the River Lesk. Behind it stood a similar galvanized iron shed, though this one looked smaller and featured windows in the gables. Its back was only about 100 feet from the railway, with a yard enclosed by a tall galvanized iron fence in between. Above the fence, the tops of numerous stacks of pit-props were visible. A siding extended from the railway into the yard. A path led from a door in the fence across the tracks to a small gate in the hedge along the lane, where a sign warned, "Beware of the trains." The area seemed deserted, and the gates leading into the enclosure were shut. Gibbons paused to survey the scene. "How on earth are we going to get close to that place without being spotted?" he asked. "It's like a fortress. There's no cover anywhere." He spoke the truth. The land around the depot was remarkably open. It was flat except for the low bank, about 4 or 5 feet high, where the railway tracks lay. Clusters of trees were further inland, but none lined the shore, and the nearest building, a large factory-like structure beside a cottage, was at least 300 yards away in the direction of Hull. "Seems like quite the design choice, doesn't it, Gibbons?" Bostick commented as they resumed their walk. "Considering how crowded this area is, it's hard to find a more isolated spot." Gibbons nodded as they turned away from the shed. "I was just thinking the same. They could pull off any schemes they wanted there, and no one would have a clue." They made their way toward the factory-like building. It was situated on the inland side of the railway, with a lane veering away from the tracks to reveal what appeared to be its front. A siding ran into the back of the building, with connections across the main lines and a signal cabin visible in the distance. A few yards ahead stood the cottage, now clearly empty and falling apart. "Hey, Gibbons, look at that!" Bostick exclaimed suddenly. They had walked along the lane until the front of the building came into view, revealing its sign. Ackroyd and Bolt, licensed rectifiers. "I had a feeling it was a distillery," Bostick continued, brimming with excitement. "No doubt about it, Gibbons, this is a real find. It's quite telling, don't you think?" Gibbons didn't share his enthusiasm. "I'm not so sure," he replied thoughtfully. "You think this supports my brandy smuggling theory? How so?" "Well, consider it. We suspect brandy smuggling, and here at the center of it all, the closest building in this secluded area is a distillery, A rectifying house, no less. Isn't that a bit too convenient? How better to get rid of their product than by handing it over to rectifiers? Do you really see a difference between distillers and rectifiers? Absolutely. Rectifiers face less scrutiny. Wouldn't you agree that the regulations on measuring the spirit produced in stills are so strict that committing fraud is nearly impossible? Rectifiers, however, don't produce the spirit themselves. They just refine what others have made, so they aren't monitored as closely. They could definitely move smuggled goods more easily than distillers could. Gibbons shook his head. Maybe in theory, he conceded, but practically it doesn't hold up. Both types are under such close watch by authorities that neither could pull off a scam like that. I think the presence of this place doesn't really help us. Isn't it just as likely that the same factors attracting Ackroyd and Bolt also drew in the syndicate? I mean, it's a prime location. Where else in the area could you find a better spot? The land is cheap and abundant, plus there are good steamer and rail connections. Still seems like a coincidence to me. I don't see it that way. Unless we can prove that the ship is delivering brandy, the issue is moot, Gibbons stated flatly. Bostick chuckled lightly. That's disappointing, he replied. I thought I had stumbled upon something significant, but it brings us back to the point. We need to inspect that depot. If we find nothing there, we'll have to keep an eye on the Girondin while it unloads. If we can get close enough, they won't be able to offload anything substantial without us noticing. Gibbons nodded in agreement, and the two men continued walking in silence, each lost in thought about the challenge Bostick had laid out. They both understood that detective work was far more complicated than they had initially anticipated. Had they not been driven by strong motives to pursue the investigation, they might have felt discouraged. Gibbons envisioned the recognition he would receive for exposing a wide-reaching conspiracy, while for Bostick, saving Madeleine Slatton from the entanglement she seemed to be caught in had become his sole priority. Having walked a half-mile from the distillery, Gibbons suddenly paused and glanced at his watch. 10 minutes to noon, he said. Since we have some time to spare, let's head back and keep an eye on that place. Something might happen this afternoon, and if nothing does, we can watch for the laborers leaving and see if we can gather any information from them. They turned back, retracing their steps past the distillery and depot. After slipping into a small grove, they settled on a bank where they could keep an eye on the enclosure. The day was warm and somewhat draining, and both men appreciated the respite in the cool shade. They remained mostly silent, smoking steadily as they mulled over the challenges ahead. Before them, the land sloped gently down to the railway track, where the sunlight glinted off the polished rails. Beyond lay the vast stretch of the river, with a brilliant band of shimmering gold marking its surface and obscuring the distant shoreline with its radiance. A few small boats drifted lazily near the bank, while further out, a large steamer occasionally appeared, making its way up the channel towards Goole. From time to time, trains thundered by, the steam barely visible in the dry air. The afternoon passed leisurely, though not uncomfortably, until around 5 o'clock when they noticed the first signs of activity at the syndicate's depot, which had stirred since their arrival. The door in the corrugated fence swung open, and 5 figures stepped out, slowly crossing the railway. They paused for a moment after they reached the lane, then split up, 4 heading east toward the distillery, while the 5th made his way north towards the spot where the watchers were concealed. As they emerged from their hiding place onto the road, they saw the 5th figure transform into a middle-aged man of working class, slow-moving, heavy-set, and somewhat rotund. His dull features revealed hardly any spark of intelligence. He seemed unaware of the others as he approached, showing neither surprise nor curiosity when Gibbons spoke to him. "Is there anywhere around here to get a drink?" The man slowly nodded to the left. "Up in the village," he replied. "Raven Bar." "Why don't you come show us the way and join us for a drink?" Gibbons suggested. The man caught on, and his eyes brightened. "Sure," he replied simply. As they walked, Gibbons tried to engage him in light conversation, but the man remained largely unresponsive. It wasn't until he had polished off his 3rd bottle of beer that he began to open up. Any chance there's work where you're employed? Gibbons continued. My friend and I would be happy to take on anything. The man shook his head, seeming not to find anything unusual about the question. Don't think so. No harm in asking the boss, though. Where can we find him? Most likely down at the works. He's usually there. I'd prefer to go to his house. Do you know where he lives? Yeah, down at the works. But he doesn't actually sleep at the works, does he? Yeah, he sleeps in a tin hut. The friends exchanged worried looks. Their situation was turning out to be even more complicated than they had anticipated. A covert inspection seemed increasingly impossible. Gibbons persisted with the difficult conversation. We thought there might be some stevedoring work available. You do get a steamer in every now and then, don't you? The man acknowledged this, and after much tedious questioning, they discovered that the Girondin came by roughly every 10 days, staying for about 48 hours, and was expected to arrive in 3 or 4 days. Realizing they weren't going to get any more information from him, they left their simple-minded companion with a fresh supply of beer and returned to the station, catching the first train back to Hull. That evening, as they sat smoking after dinner, they tackled the perplexing problem once again. It seems to me, Gibbons stated, that we should focus on the smuggling idea first. Not because I fully believe in it, but because it's the only lead we have. And this takes us back to the same issue, the unloading of the Girondin. Bostick didn't respond, so Gibbons continued. Any plan we make involves a preliminary visit to assess the situation. We can't approach that place during the day. If we try to sneak around, we could easily be spotted from those windows or the wharf. On the other hand, if we concoct a story and go openly, we risk being recognized if they have our descriptions or photographs. So, we need to go at night. Okay. Clearly, we can only approach the place by land or by water. If we go by land, we either have to climb onto the pier from the shore, which we're not sure we can manage, or risk making noise while climbing over the galvanized iron fence. Plus, we might leave footprints or other evidence behind. But if we go by water, we can muffle our oars and glide down to the wharf without a sound. They're bound to be stairs, and we can slip away without making a sound. Bostick nodded enthusiastically, clearly in agreement. Great, he exclaimed warmly. How about we get a boat tomorrow and give it a shot that night? I think that's a solid plan. There's another thing, too. If there's an alarm, we can escape by the river a lot easier than if we head across the fields. It's a blessing there's no moon. The next day their focus shifted. They needed to find a small, manageable skiff for rent. It turned out to be a challenging task, but by late afternoon they finally found what they were looking for. They also picked up snug caps and rubber-soled shoes, along with some food for the night, a couple of flashlights, and a length of black cloth. Just before dusk settled in, they took their places in the boat and set out on the wide river. The evening was lovely, a perfect end to a wonderful day. The air felt soft and pleasant, and a light mist hung over the water, softening the sharp outlines of the town's buildings and turning the opposite shore into a hazy blur. Not a hint of wind stirred, and the water lay like glass, undisturbed by the slightest ripple. Both men felt a rush of excitement as they rowed down the wide stretch of shimmering gold, heading west toward the setting sun. With the tide in their favor, it took little effort to make their way upstream. As darkness fell, they drew closer to the shore until, in the dwindling light, they spotted the railway station at Hassel. They stopped rowing, allowing the boat to drift along as the last traces of light vanished from the sky. They had carefully muffled their oars, then turned north and began to scull gently toward the bank. A few lights flickered to life, and soon they recognized the railway signals and cabin by the distillery sidings. Just 200 or 300 yards more, Gibbons whispered softly. They were now nearing the beach, allowing their small boat to drift until the dark outline of the wharf appeared ahead. Gibbons dipped his oars, steering the boat quietly alongside. Just as they had imagined from afar, the wharf was constructed in the same way as the one on the River Lesk. It had 2 lines of pilings arranged like the letter V, with the vertical post in front and the other slanting back to support the earthwork behind. The steps were in the same relative position as before, and Gibbons secured the painter with a slip hitch that could easily be undone. With great care, both men stepped onto the shore and slowly climbed the steps, peering over the deck of the wharf. As far as they could see in the dim light, the layout was similar to what they had encountered in France. Narrow-gauge tramways ran parallel from the hut toward the water, connected by a crossroad and turntables at the front of the wharf. Stacks of pit props were situated between the tracks, and deck-uval trucks were scattered here and there. However, they noticed these details later. What first caught their eye were the lights glowing in the third and fourth windows from the left end of the shed. Clearly, the manager was still inside. "We should head back to the boat and wait," Gibbons whispered, and they carefully descended the steps. After intervals of about half an hour, one of them would ascend to check the windows. The first 2 times, the light remained the same, but on the third, it moved to the first and second windows, and by the fourth, it was gone, suggesting that the manager had left his sitting room and retired to his bedroom. "It's best if we wait at least another hour," Gibbons murmured again. Time dragged on in the darkness under the wharf, the only sound the gentle lapping of water against the pilings. The boat floated almost still, stirring only when one of the men shifted, causing it to lean slightly and send out tiny ripples. It wasn't cold, and had they not been so caught up in their adventure, they could have easily fallen asleep. Every so often, Gibbons checked his glowing watch, but it wasn't until the hands pointed to 1:30 that they decided to move. Quietly, they ascended to the wharf above. The structure was lined with railings that extended back to the gables of the tin house, which stretched all the way across the base of the pier. The 2 friends made their way across this enclosed space, but it quickly became clear that there was nothing of interest to find. Beyond the stacks of props and wagons, they encountered only a rusty steam winch, a large water butt with a downspout from the roof, a tank elevated on a stand with a flexible pipe clearly meant for supplying crude oil to the ship's engines, and several empty barrels that had once contained oil. With their torch carefully covered by a piece of black cloth, the friends scrutinized these items, especially the oil tank, which connected the ship and shore and raised their suspicions. However, they soon concluded that neither it nor any of the other objects were relevant to what they were looking for. Retreating to the edge of the wharf, they held a quiet discussion. Gibbons suggested trying one of the doors in the shed at the far end, away from the manager's room. But Bostick, consumed by the need to see the unloading of the Girondin, argued that what was inside the shed was unimportant, and that they should focus on finding a vantage point to observe from. "If we could find a way into one of those stacks of props," he said, "we could keep a perfect watch. I could slip in now, for instance. You can take over tomorrow night, and then I'll cover your shift the following night, and so on. We would be able to see everything that gets unloaded. But," he added with a hint of disappointment, "even if we managed to get inside, I'm not sure we'd be able to stay hidden. Besides, they might decide to stack things on top of us." "Afraid that plan won't work," Gibbons replied, but then his eyes lit up. "Wait, what about that barrel? Maybe we could fit inside that one." "The barrel, that's a brilliant idea." Bostick felt the excitement surge as well. "That is, if it has a lid." They retraced their steps. They didn't bother with the tank. It was a galvanized iron box with a lid riveted on and full of oil. The barrel, however, looked promising. It was a particularly large cask with a lid that extended over the top rim, completely shielding the inside from view. It was tucked into the corner next to the right side of the shed, away from the manager's rooms, and a wooden downspout from the roof ran through a slot cut in the edge of the lid. It couldn't have been a better spot for an observation post. "Let's see if we can lift the lid," Gibbons whispered. They discovered it was simply resting on the rim, secured with cleats below to keep it from sliding off. They lifted it easily, and Gibbons shone his electric flashlight inside. The cask was empty, clearly due to the prolonged drought. "That works," Bostick said, relieved. "That's all we need to know. Let's get out of here." They lowered the lid and paused for a moment. Gibbons still wanted to check the shed doors, but Bostick was adamant. "Let's go," he urged again. "We've done well. Why risk messing it up?" They returned to the boat and debated their next steps. Bostick's proposal was to figure out when the Girondin was due, then come the night before to drill a few small holes in the cask. One of them could then climb inside, stocked with provisions, and take their watch. The other man would row away, rest, and sleep through the day, returning the following night so they could switch places, continuing this until the Girondin departed. In this manner, he insisted, they would inevitably uncover the truth, at least concerning the smuggling. "Do you really think we can manage 24 hours in that barrel?" Gibbons asked. "Of course we can. We have to. Come on, Gibbons, it's our only option." It didn't take much convincing for Gibbons to agree to the plan, and they untied their line and slipped away from the wharf quietly. The tide had shifted, and soon they relaxed their paddles, allowing the boat to drift gently downstream. The first light of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky as they passed Hassel, and for the next hour they lay at the bottom of the boat, smoking and captivated by the stunning display of the rising day. Not wanting to arrive in Hull too early, they paddled inshore and landed in a small cove, where they stretched out in the soft grass and slept for 3 or 4 hours. Afterward, they got back on the boat, rowing and drifting until, between 7 and 8 o'clock, they reached the wharf from which they had rented their boat. An hour later, they were back at their hotel, recovering from the night's exertions with cold baths and a hearty breakfast. Chapter 8. After breakfast, Gibbons vanished. He claimed he was heading out to mail a letter, but he didn't reappear until nearly 3 o'clock. "Sorry about that, my friend," he greeted Bostick. "I had an idea hit me while I was on my way to the post office, and it took longer to sort out than I expected. You realize that life in that barrel won't be pleasant for our unfortunate friend." "It'll be terrible," Bostick agreed curtly, "but there's no use fretting about it. We're committed now." "Exactly," Gibbons replied. "But for that very reason, we want to limit our exposure. We could easily find ourselves trapped for a full day longer than we need to be." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean we can't go back to the wharf until the night before the Girondin arrives." "I don't see how we can be certain of that." "I had the same thought until I posted my letter. That's when I had my breakthrough. It seemed worth investigating, so I visited the shipping offices until I could find an old issue of Lloyd's List. It's a daily publication that details the arrivals and departures of ships at ports around the world. My idea was that if we could compile a list of the Girondin's arrivals and departures from Selden for the past 3 months, and if we found she maintained a regular schedule, we could predict when she would be due to arrive next. Do you understand?" "Definitely." I was able to compile the list without much hassle, but I found the results a bit underwhelming. The trip always took either 10, 11, or 12 days, and for a while I couldn't figure out why. Then I realized it was all about Sundays. If you exclude the Sundays the Girondin spends in port, the round trip consistently takes exactly 10 days. I had the details of the Lesk arrival and departure from the single trip we were there, so I could piece together the entire cycle. She spends 2 days loading in Lesk, 3 days sailing to Hull, 2 days unloading in Selden, and 3 days returning to France. Based on her last call and the information they had, she should be back early Friday morning. "Great," Bostick said enthusiastically. "Really great, and today is Thursday. We've just enough time to prepare." They headed out to buy a 1-inch auger and a 3/16 bradawl, along with a sturdy footstool and a satchel. They stuffed the satchel with a loaf of bread, some cheese, a packet of figs, a few bottles of soda water, and a flask of whiskey. Along with their caps, rubber shoes, electric torches, and a piece of black cloth, they took everything to their boat. After that, they returned to the hotel and relaxed until 11 o'clock. They solemnly drew lots for the first watch, knowing this was no laughing matter. If they unloaded at night, it would be hard to get relief during the ship's stay. However, Bostick, lucky in the draw, felt confident he could manage his watch. By 11:30, they were paddling up the river again. The weather was just as perfect as the night before, except this time a light westward breeze had created countless tiny ripples that lapped gently around the bow of their boat as they glided through. They weren't in a rush, and it wasn't until after one that they tied up to the depot steps. Everything above was dark and quiet as they carried their supplies and stealthily approached the barrel. Carefully, they lifted the lid, and Bostick, balancing on the footstool, squeezed himself inside with some difficulty. Gibbons then placed the footstool on the rim and lowered the lid onto it, passing in the satchel of food and the auger through the gap that was left. They needed to create a way to observe, so they figured 2 holes would do the trick, one facing the front of the wharf and the other at a right angle, looking down the side of the shed. Slowly, from inside, Bostick began to drill. He made a sound like a mouse nibbling, but varied his pace to avoid giving away his presence to anyone who might be awake and listening. Gibbons placed his hand on the outside of the barrel and paused when he felt the auger break through. He then finished the hole from the outside with his bradawl. This created an opening that was barely noticeable on the rough exterior, but spacious inside, allowing the watcher to see a much broader view than otherwise possible. Gibbons then lifted the lid again, letting Bostick retrieve the footstool from inside, where it was intended to serve as a seat for him. Everything was now in place, and after a quiet exchange of well wishes, Gibbons stepped away, ensuring with a careful glance that no traces had been left behind. He returned to the boat, untied the painter, and gently moved away into the night. Alone in the cramped darkness of the cask, Bostick began to assess his situation. He hoped to fall asleep to pass the time, which would otherwise feel excruciatingly long, so that he would be alert when he was needed. Yet his unfamiliar surroundings fueled his imagination, preventing him from resting. He was surprised by how fresh the air felt. Thankfully, the hole in the lid that received the downspout was quite large, ensuring he had enough air and was safe from suffocation. The night was eerily quiet. Straining to listen, he couldn't detect the slightest sound. The silence and total darkness soon became overwhelming, prompting him to pull out his watch for the comfort of its ticking and the sight of its hands and numbers glowing faintly. He found himself pondering, once again, the main concern occupying his mind. What were the syndicate members up to? Was Mr. Slatton in danger of prosecution, possibly facing penal servitude? Could it be that, through some convoluted legal reasoning or misleading circumstantial evidence, Miss Slatton, Madeleine, could be implicated? Oh, if only he knew what was wrong, perhaps he could help. If he could just get her out of this mess, and for Mr. Slatton's sake, too. Once they were safe, he could share what he knew with the police and wash his hands of the whole affair. But he was constantly shrouded in a frustrating ignorance that thwarted him at every turn. He didn't know the nature of the problem, and any attempt he made could inadvertently lead to the very disaster he most wanted to prevent. What if he went and asked her directly? This thought had crossed his mind many times before, and he had always dismissed it as impractical. But what if he actually did it? The risk was that she might get upset or offended, refuse to acknowledge that anything was amiss, and insist he never bring it up again, or perhaps even send him away completely. He sensed he wasn't strong enough to handle that possibility. No, he had to understand where he stood first. He needed clarity about his position to avoid making a mess of things. Gibbons was right. They had to find out what the syndicate was up to. There was no other option. As the hours dragged on, eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Bostick noticed 2 faint glimmers of light emerging at the edges of his vision. Settling onto his footstool, he leaned forward, putting his eye to each opening in turn. It was still the cold, dim light of early dawn, before the sun had risen to bring color and sharpness to the world, but the basic shapes of objects were becoming clearer. Peering out, he felt a wave of relief. It turned out his outlooks were correct. From either opening, he could see the entire wharf area. It was around 5 a.m., and he congratulated himself that what he hoped would be the most tedious part of his watch was finally coming to an end. Soon the place would come alive, and time would pass more swiftly as events unfolded. But the 3 hours before anything happened felt even longer than the wait before dawn. Just as his watch struck 8, he heard a key turn in a lock, a door creaked open, and a man stepped out from the shed by the wharf. He was a young man, slender in build, with a sharp and intelligent face, though his expression was rather unpleasant. The pallor of his skin was highlighted by his almost jet-black hair and dark eyes. He wore a loose grey Norfolk jacket and knickerbockers, and he had no hat. He took a few steps forward and stared downstream toward Hull. "I see her, Tom," he suddenly called out to someone inside the shed. "She's just coming around the point." Another figure emerged, an older man who appeared to be a foreman. His face contrasted with the younger man. It bore a kind expression, kindly, trustworthy, and honest, but he didn't seem particularly sharp. He looked like an earnest, hard-working man. He, too, gazed toward the east. "Aye," he replied slowly. "She's early." 2 hours, the younger man agreed. "Didn't expect her until 10 or 11. The foreman murmured something about getting things ready and vanished back into the shed. Soon, there were sounds of doors being opened, and several empty deck-uval trucks were pushed out onto the wharf. At intervals, both men re-emerged, watching downstream, clearly anticipating the ship's arrival. After about half an hour, the increased activity ahead signaled that she was nearing. The manager walked down the wharf again, followed by the foreman and 4 other men, presumably the entire staff, including the rather dull-looking fellow whom the friends had tried to question during their first visit. Then came a long wait, during which Bostick could hear the sound of a ship's telegraph and the churn of the screw, and at last the bow of the Girondin appeared, slowly making its way in. Ropes were thrown, caught, looped over bollards, pulled tight and secured, and she was docked. Captain Beamish stood on the bridge, and as soon as he could, the manager hopped aboard, hurried up the steps, and joined him. Moments later, both men slipped into the captain's cabin. The foreman and his crew followed on board and leisurely began opening the hatches, but for at least an hour there was no real rush to get started. Then the pace picked up. The hatches were fully opened, the ship's winches began to whir, and the unloading of the props commenced. It was simply the reverse of what they had seen during loading. The crew of the Girondin swung out the props in bundles, lowered them onto the deck-uval trucks, and the depot workers pushed them back through the shed. Empty trucks were returned along a different route and brought back to the starting point using the turntables. The young manager observed the operations and kept a tally of the props. Bostick kept a close watch on everything, certain he was witnessing the full proceedings. Every truckload of props passed within 10 feet of his hiding spot, and he felt confident he would notice if anything other than props was unloaded. However, the intense scrutiny took its toll, and he soon started feeling weary. He had some bread and fruit, along with a whiskey and soda, and while he would have happily traded a lot for a smoke, he felt much better. The work continued without pause until 1 o'clock when the men stopped for lunch. At 2, they resumed and worked steadily throughout the afternoon, well past 7. During all that time, only 2 minor incidents broke the monotony. Early in the morning, Buller arrived, and under his direction, the end of the flexible hose from the crude oil tank was brought aboard and connected to a pipe on the lower deck. A wheel valve on the tank was opened, and Bostick watched the hose shift and tighten as oil began to flow through it. An hour later, the valve was shut off, the hose relaxed, the connection was uncoupled, and the dripping hose, stained with dark oil, was carried back and returned to its original spot on the wharf. The second event took place around 3 o'clock, when Captain Beamish and Buller exited the ship together and made their way through the shed. Bostick was utterly exhausted. His head throbbed painfully from the strain and the stench of the barrel, which by now had grown quite foul. Yet he realized that now, with the men gone, the conspirators had their chance. The moment he had been waiting for was nearing, and he steeled himself to combat the overwhelming drowsiness that threatened to sabotage his watch. Hour after hour passed slowly, each one dragging on with nothing happening. Aside from the occasional movement of one of the crew on the ship, the entire area felt abandoned. It was well after 10 when night fell that he suddenly heard voices. At first he couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably Buller, and it became evident that the engineer and a few others were drawing near. Then Beamish spoke. "You'd better stay alert," he advised. "Morton says they only worked here for about a week. They've disappeared somewhere. Morton couldn't find out where, but he's trying to trace them." "I'm not worried about them," the manager replied. Even if they stumbled upon this place, which they could, they wouldn't uncover anything else. We're in too strong a position. Well, don't make the mistake of underestimating their intelligence, Beamish cautioned, as the three men strolled slowly down the wharf. Bostick felt a surge of excitement as he watched them board the ship and vanish into the captain's cabin. It was clear now that he and Gibbons were under serious suspicion from the syndicate, and that they were being followed by their spy. What chance would the spy have? And if he succeeded in what he set out to do, what would their future hold? Bostick was no coward, yet a shiver ran down his spine as he mentally retraced the steps of their current mission, realizing how poorly they had concealed their tracks. Time after time, they had inadvertently revealed themselves to anyone willing to ask a few questions. What fools they had been, he thought, not to have disguised themselves. Even simple disguises would have sufficed. They might not have fooled close friends, but they would certainly have given a stranger trying to follow their trail from descriptions and those damned photographs a much harder time. It hadn't helped that they had traveled together to Hull, and even less so that they chose the same hotel. True, they had the wit to register under false names, but that would only be a minor obstacle to a clever investigator. But their biggest mistake, in Bostick's eyes, was renting the boat and leaving the docks at night, only to return at dawn. What they should have done, he now bitterly thought, was to take a boat from Grimsby or another remote town and keep it hidden, letting no one know when they left or returned from their outings. However, lamenting over past errors would do no good. He mentally repeated the old saying, though it brought him no comfort. His thoughts shifted back to the present moment, and he considered whether he should climb out of the barrel and attempt to replicate Gibbons's daring act of boarding the Girondin to eavesdrop on the captain's cabin. But soon, he decided it was best to stick to their plan and ensure that nothing was taken from the ship under the cover of darkness. Once again, he found himself in a waiting period, the minutes stretching out painfully. Outside was completely still, until around 11:30 when the captain's cabin door creaked open, and its 3 occupants stepped out into the night. The starboard deck light was on, and in its glow Bostick saw the manager take his leave, cross the gangway, walk up the wharf, and enter the shed. Buller headed down towards his cabin door, while Beamish, turning off the deck light, returned to his own room. About 15 minutes later, his light also flickered out, plunging the area into complete darkness and silence. A couple of hours later, Bostick, who had managed to stay awake and alert only through sheer will, heard a soft tap on the barrel followed by a faint hiss. The lid was cautiously lifted, and to his immense relief, he was able to stand up and greet Gibbons crouching outside. "Any news?" Gibbons asked in the faintest whisper. "None at all. The boat only brought out props. I had a clear view the whole time. But listen, Gibbons," Bostick said, lowering his voice even more. "They're on to us and trying to trace our steps." "Let them," Gibbons replied quietly. "Take this." He passed over a satchel filled with fresh food and took back the old one. Bostick climbed out, held the lid open until Gibbons took his position, wished his friend good luck, and then moved like a shadow along the wharf. He descended the steps silently and reached the boat. Moments later, he had drifted out of sight of the depot and was pulling steadily downstream. The fresh air and the sense of freedom felt exhilarating after his long confinement, and it felt wonderful to stretch his muscles at the oars. He rowed so hard that by 3 o'clock he reached the boat's slip in Hull. There he tied up the skiff and walked to the hotel. Before 4, he was sound asleep in his room. That evening, around 7, as he strolled along the waterfront, waiting for the right time to take out his boat, he was pleased to see the Girondin heading out to sea. He had dreaded the thought of spending another 24 hours cooped up in the cask, which would have been necessary had the ship not left that night. All that was left to do was to carefully get Gibbons out, and then the immediate task would be complete. He took the boat out around 11 and arrived at the wharf as planned. The place was shrouded in darkness, and he quietly approached the barrel, lifting the lid with care. Gibbons was drained from the prolonged strain, but with his friend's assistance, he managed to climb out after making sure the barrel's floor was clear and plugging the 2 holes with corks. They returned to the boat in silence, not speaking until they were a good distance from the wharf. "Hugh, Bostick," Gibbons finally said. "That was a truly terrifying experience. The air in that cursed barrel was terrible, and it just kept getting worse. I really thought I was going to pass out or have to lift the lid and blow our cover. It took everything I had to keep from panicking until the ship left." "But did you see anything?" Bostick asked eagerly. "See anything? Not a single thing. We're chasing the wrong leads, Bostick. I'd bet my life that nothing came out of that boat except for props. I don't know what those people are up to, but one thing's for sure. They aren't smuggling anything." They continued to row in silence, Gibbons feeling sick with fatigue and disappointment, while Bostick lost in thought about their dilemma. It was still early when they returned to their hotel, and they followed Bostick's plan from the previous morning and went straight to bed. The next day, they spent their time in the hotel lounge, gloomily smoking and intermittently discussing the situation. They had concluded that they had been outsmarted, at least for the time being. Both were at a loss for what to do next. It seemed they had exhausted every possible line of investigation, without yielding any better results. They agreed that the theory about brandy smuggling had to be set aside, but they had nothing else to replace it. "We're really in a tough spot as far as I can see," Gibbons said with a sigh. "It's a bitter blow to have to abandon the one theory we managed to come up with, but it's even worse not knowing how we're going to continue the investigation." "That's true," Bostick replied, the image of Madeleine Slatten flashing into his mind. "But we can't just give up. We have to keep searching until we find something." "That sounds good in theory, but what exactly are we supposed to do next?" Silence hung in the air for several moments before Gibbons spoke again. "I'm afraid we might have to turn to Scotland Yard after all." Bostick shut up, horrified. "Not that, please," he exclaimed, echoing his protests from a previous discussion when the same idea was floated. "We have to avoid the police at all costs." He was earnest in his plea. "I understand your point," Gibbons replied, "and I agree. But if neither of us can propose another option, what do we have left?" This was the very scenario Bostick had dreaded, and he resolved to play the one weak card he had. "The license plates," he suggested. "As I mentioned earlier, that's the only concrete lead we've got in this whole mystery. Why don't we start there? If we can figure out why those plates were swapped, we might just uncover enough to solve the whole case." Gibbons, feeling the weight of his sleepless night, took a pessimistic view and wasn't enthused by the idea. He seemed to have lost his motivation for the investigation and pushed for dropping it altogether and passing what they knew over to Scotland Yard. But Bostick firmly opposed this, insisting that the real clue lay in the changes to the truck numbers. Eventually, they decided to put off the question until the next day and distract themselves that evening with a visit to a music hall. Chapter 9. Tick was roused in the early morning hours by a nudge on his shoulder, and when he opened his eyes, he was startled to see Gibbons, wearing only his pajamas, leaning over him. The expression on his friend's face was one of excitement and joy, completely transforming him from the gloomy pessimist he had been the day before. "Bostick, my friend," he exclaimed in hushed tones, "it was just past 5. I'm terribly sorry to wake you, but I couldn't help it. You and I are quite the pair of fools." Bostick grunted in response. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he muttered sleepily. "Talking about," Gibbons replied eagerly. "Why, this whole situation, of course. I see it now, but I can't understand how we missed it before. The idea struck me like a bolt of lightning. Just while you were blinking, I figured it all out." Fully awake now, Bostick shifted with annoyance. "For heaven's sake, explain yourself," he demanded. "What's the big revelation?" "How they're doing it. We assumed it was brandy smuggling, but we couldn't figure out how it happened. Well, it's definitely brandy smuggling, and we'll catch them this time. Bostick, we're going to get them." Gibbons was brimming with enthusiasm. He couldn't stay still and began to pace the room. His excitement was contagious, and Bostick felt his heartbeat quicken as he listened. Gibbons continued. "We suspected there might be brandy. Honestly, we couldn't think of anything else. But we didn't see any brandy, we saw pit props. Isn't that right? Well, Bostick responded impatiently. What's next? That's it, Gibbons declared with a delighted laugh. That's the whole thing. Don't you understand it now? Bostick felt a surge of frustration. Blast it, Gibbons, he protested. If you've got nothing better to do than wake me. Oh, don't get all worked up, Gibbons interrupted with another joyful chuckle. What I'm saying makes perfect sense. Just think about it. We thought the brandy would be unloaded. And what's more, we both sat in that wretched barrel and watched the whole thing happen. But all we saw coming ashore were pit props. Bostick, just pit props. Don't you see? Bostick suddenly gasped. Good Lord, he exclaimed, breathless. It was in the props. Of course it was in the props, Gibbons said, a triumphant gleam in his eye. Hollow props. A few hollow ones filled with brandy to unload in their shed, and plenty of genuine ones to sell. What do you make of that, Bostick? They've been caught at last, right? Bostick lay still, trying to wrap his head around the implications of this idea. Gibbons was moving around the room energetically, like a marionette on strings, continuing to speak. I figured it out while lying in bed before I came over. All they would need to do is cut the props in half and bore them out, attaching a screwed ring to one half and a screwed socket to the other, so they can fit together just like a regular gas thimble. Got it. Bostick nodded slowly. Next, they get some steel cylinders, something like oxygen tanks, to fit inside. They'd be made with the right thickness so their weight, combined with the brandy, would match the weight of the wood that was removed. He paused to look at Bostick, who nodded again. The rest would be as simple as falling off a log. At night, Slatton and his crew would unscrew the hollow ends, fill the cylinders with brandy, screw the ends back on, and there you have it. Harmless, innocent props, ready to be loaded onto the Girondin. Naturally, they'd have to mark them. Then when they're being unloaded, the manager would set aside the marked ones, those that could be defective, whether they were too long, too short, too thin, or anything else you might imagine. He would find some reason to separate them out, and at night he'd open them up, pour out the brandy, reseal them, and there you have it. Gibbons paused for effect, like a magician revealing a hidden trick. That explains why that Selden manager is sleeping in the shed, Bostick chimed in. Exactly, I hadn't considered that. Bostick continued. Plus, there'd be enough legitimate props on each trip to make the trade believable. Of course, just a few fake ones would suffice, maybe 2 or 3% of the total. Good grief, Bostick, it's a smart scheme. They deserve to succeed. But they won't. He chuckled with delight. Bostick, meanwhile, had fallen into a deep train of thought. He regained his composure and began to analyze the idea critically. They might not even dispose of the brandy themselves, he said carefully. What's to stop them from passing off the fake props to the firm that supplies the brandy? That's a valid point, Gibbons replied. That's another angle to consider. Goodness, the potential this idea has. They continued discussing for a while, and then Gibbons, whose initial excitement was fading, went back to his room for some clothes. A few minutes later, he returned with a fresh perspective. Let's figure out how much you could fit into a prop, he suggested. Suppose we have a prop that's 9 inches in diameter and 9 feet long. You can't weaken it too much or it might break if it falls. What if you bored a 6-inch hole down its center? That would leave the sides 1.5 inches thick, which should be sufficient. What do you think? Let's go with that for now, Bostick replied. Great, now how long would it be? If we drill the hole too deep, we risk splitting the prop. How about 2 feet 6 inches into each end? Say a 5-foot tube. Let's go with that, Bostick replied. How much brandy could fit into a 6-inch tube that's 5 feet long? He worked it out loud, with Bostick double-checking at every step. That gives us a cubic foot of brandy, which is 6¼ gallons, 50 pints, or 400 glasses. 400 glasses per prop. He paused, glanced at his friend, and continued. A glass of brandy in France costs 6 pence. In England, it costs half a crown. So if you can smuggle it over, you make a profit of 2 shillings for each glass. 400 glasses at 2 shillings each adds up to a profit of £40 per prop. Bostick. Bostick whistled. The more he thought about it, the more plausible the idea seemed. He listened intently as Gibbons, once more energized and pacing the room, went on with his calculations. Now, you've got a cargo of around 7,000 props. Let's say we assume 1% of them are fakes. That would be 70. We can't be certain how many are actually fake, but 1 out of every 100 seems like a safe estimate. 70 fakes means £2,800 profit per trip. And with a trip every 10 days, let's say 30 trips a year to be cautious, that's an annual profit of £84,000. My goodness, Bostick, it would definitely be worth taking some risks for £84,000 a year. Risks, Bostick exclaimed, now just as thrilled as his friend. They take all kinds of risks for that. I bet, Gibbons, you've finally hit on something. £84,000 a year. But hold on. His tone shifted. You have to share that among the crew. That's true, Gibbons acknowledged. But how many are there? Beamish, Buller, Slatt and Henry, the manager here, and the 2 men they mentioned, Morton and Archer. That makes 7. Each would still get £12,000 a year. It's still incredibly worthwhile. Worthwhile, absolutely. Bostick sat quietly, deep in thought about the idea. He spoke again. Of course, your figures are just guesses. They're just guesses, Gibbons replied, slightly impatient, because we don't know how big the tubes are or how many props there are, but it's clear they can make a fortune smuggling this way. We now understand that it can be done, and how it can be done. That's a step forward, at the very least. Bostick nodded, and propped himself up in bed. Could you please pass me my pipe and tobacco from that coat pocket? He asked slowly. I have a feeling it's going to be quite a challenge to prove any of this. We'll need to see if the props are emptied at that depot. If they aren't, we'll have to trace where they go next and investigate that. I can see there's quite an extensive task ahead of us. Do you have any plans? Not a single plan, Gibbons said cheerfully. There's no time for that yet, but we'll figure something out. They continued to discuss the matter in more detail. At first, testing Gibbons's new theory seemed straightforward, but the more they considered it, the more complicated it became. For starters, there would be the investigations at the depot. Any unloading of the brandy would likely happen inside the shed, and at night. So they would need to find a hiding spot within the building for their observations. This alone was fraught with challenges. For one, all the doors of the shed were locked, and they wouldn't open quietly. How could they get through those doors in the dark without keys, silently, and without leaving evidence? They might need to watch the place every night for the entire 10-day cycle, which meant at some point each night, someone would have to open and close one of those doors to relieve the observer. If the props were to be removed at night, how could they make sure that this wouldn't happen at the same time as the relief's visit? This was assuming, of course, that they could find a suitable hiding spot within the building where they could easily keep an eye on the activities at hand. There were definitely some significant challenges here, but even if they managed to navigate those, it didn't guarantee that they had solved the entire issue. The fake props could be loaded and sent off to another depot, which wouldn't be easy to track down. If they did locate this new depot, they would then need to observe the goings-on inside after dark. It seemed to them that everything they had accomplished so far would be mere child's play compared to what lay ahead. Throughout that day and into the next, they agonized over the problem, but to no avail. The longer they contemplated it, the more impossible it appeared. Even Gibbons's usual cheerful outlook couldn't withstand the wave of gloom that rolled over him. Ironically, it was Bostick, the steady, not particularly brilliant one, who came up with a solution first. They were seated in the otherwise empty hotel lounge when he suddenly paused in his smoking, sat in silence for nearly a minute, and then turned eagerly to his friend. "Hey, Gibbons," he said, "what if there's actually another way out of this? A plan to make them separate the fake props from the real ones? Are you familiar with Letham, Charlie Letham from Ellerby, somewhere between Selby and Bourton? No. Well, he owns a bunch of mines out there. He's a good guy, just swimming in cash. What if we went to Charlie, explained the whole situation and asked him to see if he could buy a full cargo of props. I should mention that he has a private wharf for lighters on one of those rivers up beyond Goole, but the water is too shallow for a seagoing vessel. Now, why shouldn't he let these people know about his wharf, claiming he had heard the Girondin was light in the draft and might be able to come in? He could then propose to take an entire shipment on the condition that he could receive it at his own wharf, thus saving rail transport from Selden. That would put the syndicate in a tough spot. They wouldn't be able to let any of the fake props leave their possession, and if they accepted Letham's proposal, they would have to separate the fake props from the genuine ones and keep the fakes on board. On their way back from Letham, they would need to stop by Selden to drop off the fakes, and if we're not complete fools, we should be able to grab them then. What do you think, Gibbons? Gibbons slapped his thigh. Brilliant, he exclaimed with excitement. I think it's absolutely fantastic, but is there any chance your friend would take such a large order? After all, we're talking about £4,000 or £5,000 here. Why wouldn't he? He needs to buy props anyway, and these are good ones. They'd be just as affordable as any others. Taking them at his own wharf makes perfect sense. Besides, 7,000 props isn't a big deal for a mining group. They go through a tremendous quantity. You have a point there. But the syndicate might not go along with it, Bostick continued. Still, I think they will. It would look suspicious if they turned down such a solid offer. Gibbons nodded. Then a new thought seemed to hit him, and he sat up straight. But Bostick, old friend, he said, you've overlooked something. If they sent a cargo like that, they would only ship genuine props. They wouldn't take the risk with the fakes. But Bostick remained undeterred. I suppose you're right, he conceded, but we can easily fix that. Imagine if Letham sets up a shipment for an unspecified future date. Then, right after the Girondin leaves France, he goes to Selden and says another shipment has fallen through, asking if they could let him take the next one. That would solve the problem, wouldn't it? By Jove, Bostick, you're really getting the hang of this detective thing. I think it's worth a shot. How do you plan to get in touch with your contact? I'll call him since we're heading over tomorrow to see him. Letham was just stepping out of his office when Bostick's call came through. I'd be thrilled to see you both, he replied. But why don't you come over now and stay the night? You'd be a huge help to me. Hilda's in London, and I'm all alone in the house. Bostick expressed his gratitude, and later the two friends caught the 6:35 train to Ellerby. Letham's car was waiting at the station, and in no time they arrived at the mineowner's home. Charles Letham was around 35, tall, broad-shouldered and fit. He had a strong, clean-shaven face and a warm yet straightforward manner, exuding a sense of decisiveness and competence that instilled confidence in those around him. This is delightful, he greeted them. How are you, old friend? Pleasure to meet you, Gibbons. This is much better than the quiet evening I was anticipating. They went in for dinner soon after, but it wasn't until the meal wrapped up and they settled into wicker chairs on the terrace, enjoying the cool evening air, that Bostick returned to the topic that had brought them together. I have to admit, he began, it's only now, when I find myself in a tight spot, that I realize how presumptuous it is for us to come to you like this, and by the time you hear what we're thinking, you'll probably agree. The truth is, we've come across some information suggesting that a criminal organization is at work. For various reasons, we can't go to the police, so we're trying to play detectives ourselves, and now we're facing a problem we can't seem to solve. We thought if we could get you interested enough to join us, we might come up with a plan. A look of disbelief sparked on Letham's face as Bostick spoke. This sounds like something out of the new Arabian Nights, he exclaimed. You're not joking with me, are you? Bostick quickly reassured him. It's actually quite serious, he continued. If our suspicions are correct, the people involved won't hesitate to use harsh measures to keep their secrets. I imagine they wouldn't think twice about dealing with anyone who pokes their nose in. Letham's astonishment didn't fade, but he could only manage a by Jove. For that reason, We can only share this in strict confidence." Bostick paused to glance at his companion, who nodded in silent agreement. "It all started when I was cycling from Bayonne to Bordeaux," Bostick continued, recounting his visit to the clearing, his discoveries with Gibbons, what they had learned in France, their trip to Hull, the Selden depot, and the adventures they encountered there. He wrapped up by explaining their idea about the hollow pit props and the challenge they found themselves facing. Letham listened intently, clearly engaged by the story. When Bostick finished, Letham expressed his astonishment with a long and intricate oath. Then he asked how they thought he might help. Bostick laid out the details. At first, the mine owner seemed taken aback, then he burst out laughing and slapped his thigh. "By the Lord Harry," he exclaimed. "Count me in. I actually need the props, but I'd do it just to help you out. If there's anything to your suspicions, it'll be the talk of the year." After a moment of thought, he added, "I'll head down to the depot at Selden tomorrow, check out the props, and propose taking a shipment. It'll be interesting to have a chat with that manager, and you can bet I'll be keeping my eyes open. You two should lay low for now, and later tonight we can have another discussion to figure out our next steps." The next day, the friends kept a low profile, and as evening approached, they found themselves once again on the terrace with their host. It seemed he had driven to Selden around midday. The manager had been courteous, even friendly, and appeared pleased to host such an important customer. He had given him a complete tour of the entire operation without the slightest reluctance. Delighted at the chance to sell a whole cargo of props, he showed no hesitation about the Girondin unloading at Letham's wharf. The price was reasonable, but nothing out of the ordinary. "I have to say," Letham concluded, "that everything looked quite solid and professional. I checked every corner of that shed and surrounding area and saw nothing even slightly suspicious. The manager's demeanor was also completely normal, so it seems to me that either he's a very talented actor or you two are chasing shadows." "We might be onto something with the hollow props," Bostick replied, "and there could be something with the brandy smuggling, but there's definitely something off. That much is clear from what Gibbons overheard." Letham nodded in agreement. "I understand that," he said, "and when we carry out our current plan, we'll learn more. Now, let's see, when does that boat leave France next?" "Thursday morning, we think," Gibbons said. "Then on Friday afternoon, I'll contact those folks and tell them that my shipment of props has gone missing, asking if they can send their boat directly here. How does that sound?" "Couldn't be better." "Then I suggest you two should get out of here for now. We need to keep our connection under wraps, and steer clear of London. That fellow Morton has tracked you down once, and he won't let it slip again. Go wander around the Peak District or something like that. You'll need to be back in Hull by Saturday." "What's that about?" both men asked in unison, surprised. "It's that blasted Beryl of yours. You mentioned the Girondin will leave France on Thursday night. That means she'll be in the Humber by Sunday night or Monday morning. You thought she'd unload here, drop off the fake props, and load up with oil at Selden on her way out. But she might not do that. It would make more sense for her to head to Selden first. That way, she'd arrive here with nothing suspicious on board and unload everything. So you'll need to hide in that Beryl on Sunday, which means getting into it on Saturday night." The two friends swore, and Letham laughed. "Good heavens," Gibbons exclaimed. "That means 4 more nights in this cursed thing. From Saturday night to Sunday night for the arrival, perhaps until Monday night if she takes time to unload the fake props then. Then we'll need another 2 or 3 nights to cover her departure. It's quite a task." "But think of the reward," Letham grinned wickedly. "I honestly don't see any other option." "There is no other option," Bostick agreed firmly. "We'll just have to grit our teeth and see it through." After some more discussion, they decided that the friends would leave early the next day for Harrogate. There, Letham would wire them on Friday with the outcome of his negotiations about the Girondin. They could then return to Hull and prepare their boat on Saturday, if needed. By the time they turned in around midnight, Letham was just as eager about the plan as his guests, and equally determined that their shared venture would succeed. The two friends enjoyed a couple of relaxing days in Harrogate until, on Friday evening, Bostick received a call on the telephone. "That must be Letham," he said excitedly. "Come on, Gibbons, let's see what he has to say." It was the mine owner, speaking from his office. "I just got off the line with our contacts," he informed them. "Everything is settled. There was a bit of a hold-up at first because Benson, the manager, worried he wouldn't have enough props for the current orders, but after checking his records, he realized he could manage, so he's allowing the ship to come in." "Great news, Letham." "The Girondin is expected to arrive around 7 tomorrow evening. Benson asked about a pilot. Apparently, their captain is certified to navigate the Humber up to Selden, but he can't take the boat any further. I told him I'd provide the man who usually works for me. Here's the plan. I'll send Angus Menzies, the captain of one of my river tugs, to the wharf at Selden by 6 on Saturday evening. When the Girondin arrives, he can go aboard and navigate her in from there. Menzies is reliable, and I'll make sure to hint that I've purchased the entire cargo, so he knows to keep an eye out for anything that shouldn't be unloaded. That should serve as an extra safeguard." The friends expressed their approval of this arrangement, and they decided that once the investigation was complete, all three would meet at Letham's house to discuss their findings. The next evening, the two investigators returned to their hotel in Hull. They had instructed the owner of their rented boat to have it ready, and around 11 o'clock, equipped with a footstool and a satchel of food, they boarded once more and set out onto the river. Not wanting to spend any more time in the cramped space than necessary, they made land near Hassel and took a couple of hours to rest. It was well past 4 by the time they arrived at the depot. The adventure felt a bit riskier this time, thanks to a thin crescent moon hanging in the sky. However, they carried out their plans without any mishaps. Bostick settled himself inside the cask, while Gibbons returned to Hull with the boat. The long, heavy hours leading up to the following evening seemed even more tedious for Bostick than they had before. He thought he might perish from boredom and fatigue long before anything exciting happened, but the thought of doing this for Madeleine Slatin kept him from collapsing altogether. Throughout the morning, Benson, the manager, or one of the other workers came out for a short time on the wharf, but there was no real work happening. The endless hours of the afternoon passed in silence, the place completely deserted, until nearly 6 o'clock, when the sound of footsteps finally reached Bostick's tired ears. He heard a gruff voice say, "I'm not so sure of it myself," which seemed to match the name of Letham's skipper, followed by Benson's voice in agreement. The two men stepped out of the shed and moved to the edge of the wharf, engaged in a casual conversation that Bostick couldn't quite follow. After a good while had passed, Benson and then Menzies began to gaze eastward down the river. Bostick sensed that the Girondin was approaching, and he felt a flicker of hope that something more engaging might soon unfold. Still, the minutes dragged painfully for another half-hour, until he heard the bell signaling the engine room and the sound of the screw in the water. Moments later, the ship came into view, eased alongside, and was secured at the dock, just as it had been before. As soon as the gangway was lowered, Benson hurried aboard, racing up the ladder to the bridge to speak with Captain Beamish. Though Bostick couldn't make out their words, he saw the captain shaking his head and making gestures of disapproval. He watched as the man approached the engine room tube and spoke into it. It was clearly a call to Buller, for almost immediately the engineer appeared and made his way up to the bridge, joining the other two for a brief discussion. Finally, Benson leaned over the side of the ship and shouted something to Menzies, who promptly boarded and joined the group on the bridge. Bostick noticed Benson introduce Menzies to the others, followed by a detailed explanation of some matter. Menzies nodded, appearing satisfied, and then the conversation opened up to everyone. Bostick felt a surge of excitement at this new development. He imagined that while Benson, ostensibly for Menzies' benefit, seemed to be making the arrangements as agreed upon, he had actually gone aboard first to warn the captain about the plan and to craft an excuse for keeping the ship anchored overnight. Buller had been summoned to be briefed on the situation, and it was not until the three of them reached a consensus on their story that they invited Menzies to join their discussion. To Bostick, it certainly looked like the men were about to fall into the trap he and his friends had laid for them. He congratulated himself for sticking to his plan and hiding in the barrel, instead of leaving the surveillance to Menzies, something he had almost done. It was evident to him that if any secret work needed to be done, Menzies would be kept out of the way until it was completed. Bostick was now sharply alert, watching every movement on the ship or wharf with the keen focus of a hawk. Soon, Buller went below deck, leaving the other three chatting on the bridge. Then there was a shift, and with the engineer reappearing, all four of them entered the cabin. It seemed they were having a meal, for about an hour later they emerged, bringing canvas chairs to the boat deck, where they settled down to smoke, everyone except Buller, who disappeared below once more. In a few moments, he emerged with a crew member and began overseeing the connection of the oil hose. The friends had realized that the ship needed to refuel, but they had expected that an hour's stop would be enough to fill up. However, with the delay in getting started and the relaxed pace of the procedure, it seemed unlikely they would leave that night. About an hour later, the oiling was finished, and Buller followed his friends to the captain's cabin, where the captain had retreated as dusk fell. An hour later, the captain came out, said good night, and they parted ways. Benson headed ashore, while Buller and Menzies went to their cabins on the main deck. Captain Beamish switched off the deck light and went back to his own room. Now or never, Bostick thought as silence and darkness settled over the wharf. But it seemed it would be never. The hours dragged on with no hint of activity. Nothing stirred on either the ship or the wharf until around 2 in the morning, when he dimly saw Gibbons approaching in the faint moonlight to take over his watch. They exchanged places quickly, and Gibbons took his post, while Bostick rowed back to Hull. Following his usual routine, he went to the hotel and went to bed. The next day, Bostick took an early train to Goole and came back right away. When he passed the depot, he saw that the Girondin had set sail. That night, he again rowed to the wharf to relieve Gibbons. They had agreed that despite the frustrating prospect of spending another night waiting in isolation, it was crucial to keep watch in case the Girondin made another stop on her way out to sea and unloaded the fake cargo. The rest of the night and the next day dragged on like a nightmare. With nothing to watch for during the early part of his shift, Bostick attempted to sleep, but found it nearly impossible. The hours dragged on with an unbearable slowness, and the following day there was little activity at the wharf to hold his attention. Just before nightfall, he was hit with the frustrating realization that his prolonged distress had been for nothing. He could see the Girondin swiftly making its way out to sea. Their plan had failed. He was too exhausted to focus on it clearly, but that much was evident. When Gibbons finally arrived, 5 hours later, he had slipped into a state of barely being awake, and his friend had to put in considerable effort to rouse him so they could leave their hiding spot quietly and cautiously. The next evening, the two friends took a late train out of Hull. Arriving at Letham's house after dusk, they soon found themselves in his smoking room with whiskies and sodas at hand, and Coronas lit between their fingers. All three felt somewhat downcast, their disappointment palpable. Letham broke the silence first. "Well," he said, taking a puff from his cigar, "I suppose we might as well be honest with one another. It seems our precious plan has collapsed." "That's about the gist of it," Gibbons replied grimly. "Your man didn't see anything?" Bostick asked. "He saw you," the mine owner responded. "He's a reliable fellow, so I thought it wise to drop a hint that we suspected something was off, which compelled him to keep a close eye. When the ship reached Selden, Benson told the captain not to tie up since he needed to go further up the river. But the captain insisted they should fill up on oil first, so he went to check with the engineer. They agreed that since they were already in, it made sense to fill up. It would save them a stop on the way back. Besides, no one wanted to navigate in the dark. There are sandbanks, after all, and the navigation isn't easy. They assigned Menzies a cabin on the starboard deck, the one facing the wharf, and he spent the entire night observing the wharf through his porthole. Not a single item was unloaded, and there wasn't a hint of movement on the wharf until you two shifted your watch. He noticed that, and it sent a thrill through him. After that, nothing else occurred until the cook brought him some coffee, and they finally set off. "Thorough enough, I'd say," Gibbons remarked. "At least we can be sure that nothing was unloaded." "Can be quite certain of that," Letham continued. "And there's something else we know as well. I made it a point to visit the wharf just as the unloading was wrapping up, and I had a chat with the captain, an impressive fellow, I must say. I told him I was intrigued by his ship, the largest I've ever seen at my wharf, and mentioned that I'd been considering having one built along similar lines. I asked if I could take a look around, and he was remarkably accommodating, showing me every part of the vessel. We inspected it thoroughly, and I'm ready to swear there were no props left on board. So it's safe to say that whatever else they're scheming, they aren't hiding brandy in fake pit props, and as far as I can tell, they aren't concealing it in anything else either." The three of them smoked in silence for a while, before Gibbons spoke again. "I suppose, Letham, you can't think of any alternative theory or suggest any other course of action for us?" "I can't tell you what to do," Letham replied, standing up and starting to pace the room. "But if I were in your position, I'd head to Scotland Yard, share what I know, and distance myself from the whole matter." Gibbons let out a sigh. "I'm afraid we may not have any choice," he said slowly, "but I shouldn't need to say that we'd much prefer to uncover something more concrete first." "True enough, but so far, you haven't been able to do that. Either these fellows are much smarter than you think, or you're completely off track. Honestly, that's my suspicion. I don't believe there's any smuggling happening at all. They're up to something else entirely, though I can't say what it is. It certainly doesn't seem to be something as straightforward as smuggling." A quiet settled over the small group once more, and after a moment, Bostick, who had been deep in thought, suddenly spoke up. "Good grief, we've been such fools. There's a critical detail we've all overlooked that proves it can't be fake props. Gibbons, this was your theory, though I don't want to load you with more foolishness than the rest of us. But anyway, following your idea, what happened to the props after they were unloaded?" Gibbons blinked at Bostick's outburst. "After they were unloaded," he echoed. "Well, they'd be returned for the next cargo, of course." "But that's the issue," Bostick exclaimed. "That's exactly what didn't happen. We've seen that boat unloaded twice, and each time no props were loaded up to be taken back." "That's a valid point," Letham interjected. "I imagine they would need to be reused. They couldn't just destroy the props after each trip and then create new ones for the next load." Gibbons shook his head slowly. "No, that's impossible. Those props would cost a fortune. You see, a cheap trick, like shipping bottles nested in hollow props, wouldn't work. The props need to be made really well, so they won't break and ruin the illusion if they happen to be dropped. They wouldn't be worth the effort unless they can be used multiple times. I'm afraid Bostick's argument holds up, and we might need to abandon our theory." Further discussion only solidified this viewpoint, and the three men realized they were utterly at a loss for their next steps. The only idea on the table was Letham's suggestion to inform Scotland Yard, a move that Gibbons reluctantly accepted as a last resort. "There's really nothing else we can do," he said with a heavy sigh. "We've tried everything we could on our own and come up short. It might be best to let someone else take a crack at it. Besides, my leave is nearly over anyway." Bostick didn't respond at the time, but the next day, after they'd said their goodbyes to their host and were on the train to King's Cross, he brought it up again. "I don't need to remind you, Gibbons," he started, "how eager I am to keep the police out of this, and I'm sure you understand why. If she finds herself in any trouble over this matter, it would effectively ruin me. Let's hold off a bit longer and think this through. Maybe we'll come up with a solution soon." Gibbons waved a hand in frustration. "If you can suggest even one thing we haven't tried yet, I'm all for it. But if you can't, I don't see how we can justify keeping all this knowledge to ourselves while waiting for a sudden burst of inspiration. Isn't that fair?" "It's absolutely fair," Bostick conceded, "and I'm not saying we should wait forever. What I propose is that we wait a month. Just give me another month, Gibbons, and I think that will be enough." I have a feeling we might discover something useful by tracking down that lorry number, and if you need to go back to work, I'll head to Bordeaux on my own to see what I can uncover. If I don't succeed, I'll still talk to her, and I'll ask her to marry me despite the trouble. Wait a month, Gibbons, and by then, I'll know where I stand. Gibbons was highly reluctant to go along with this plan. Although he understood that he couldn't present a solid case against the syndicate to his superiors, he recognized that he could still earn significant praise if he provided information that would help their detectives build one. With each passing day he hesitated, the likelihood of someone else uncovering the solution to the mystery grew, threatening to snatch away his reward. Bostick was fully aware of this situation, and he realized the risk Gibbons was taking when, after a lengthy discussion, the young man agreed to proceed. 2 days later, Gibbons returned to his office, while Bostick, after a heated argument with his partner that nearly led to a complete fallout, was once again on his way to the south of France.